From the earliest stages of its existence, the human personality is shaped by the undeniable influence of experiences, often inaccessible to full conscious awareness. Childhood trauma is not merely a fleeting incident. It is a deep, pervasive wound that settles in the depths of the psyche and hides in the most hidden recesses of consciousness. The great thinker Carl Jung asserted that everything suppressed in tender years does not simply disappear. Instead, it becomes firmly embedded in the unconscious and continuously influences a person's behavioral patterns in adult life. Imagine a child who grew up in an environment where expressing any emotion was considered a sign of weakness and unacceptable vulnerability. As an adult, this individual may face insurmountable difficulties in establishing genuine emotional connections, completely unaware that this invisible barrier was erected long before they were capable of comprehending it. The psychological impact of childhood trauma can be likened to invisible ink, leaving indelible stains on every aspect of a person's existence, unnoticed by the individual themselves. Much self-doubt, irrational fears, inexplicable anxieties, and self-destructive behavioral patterns stem from experiences buried deep in the distant past. Unable to integrate this hidden experience into their consciousness, a person will continue to be under its pervasive sway, like a helpless puppet whose strings are pulled by unseen, powerful hands. Only a deep dive into these shadows of the past can open the path to true freedom and healing. For instance, an individual raised by overly critical parents may well become an adult perfectionist who finds it exceedingly difficult to accept their own mistakes. This doesn't happen by conscious choice, but because they deeply internalize the belief that to err is to be rejected. The repression of these painful memories gives rise to what Carl Gustav Jung called the shadow, a central concept in his psychology. The shadow consists of everything a person denies within themselves: pain, unfulfilled desires, deep-seated insecurities, forbidden feelings. And the more effort is made to ignore its existence, the stronger it becomes. One might observe how some individuals experience deep irritation towards traits in others that somehow reflect aspects they themselves diligently try to hide from their own consciousness. This happens because what an individual rejects within themselves always finds a way to manifest, even if it's through projection onto others. It's important to understand that the shadow isn't limited to the consequences of major psychological traumas. Even minor wounds, such as a long-held feeling of not being heard as a child, can generate persistent behavioral patterns. Many people spend their lives in a relentless pursuit of external approval, striving to be accepted in every possible way, often unaware that this insatiable desire stems from a long-standing emotional deficit experienced in early years. Carl Jung, a prominent thinker, asserted that human wholeness can only be achieved by delving deep into one's own consciousness and bravely confronting inner torments. However, a natural question arises: how does one undertake this process? How does one begin to clearly see what has been hidden in the subconscious for so long? Notably, life itself constantly provides clues: the most intense emotional responses, persistent behavioral patterns, as well as baseless anxieties and phobias. All of these serve as unequivocal evidence that something long buried is striving to surface. Few people haven't been surprised by an excessive reaction to an ordinary, unremarkable situation. Sometimes, even a minor comment can activate an emotional trigger, compelling an individual to disproportionate actions. Such manifestations are far from accidental. They are echoes of deeply rooted childhood psychological traumas that continue to exist in the depths of the psyche, awaiting awareness and acceptance. However, the main difficulty lies in the fact that the vast majority of individuals try to avoid this inner process. A direct look at one's own shadow, according to Jungian terminology, requires immense courage. Such a step implies acknowledging that a significant portion of the suffering a person experiences is generated not only by external influences but also by their own actions and choices throughout their life journey. This realization can cause deep discomfort and painful experiences. Nevertheless, Carl Jung firmly believed that true liberation is achieved only when an individual gains enough courage to shed light on those aspects of their psyche that have hitherto remained in profound darkness. Naturally, the question arises about the starting point of this journey. One of the most effective and fruitful methods is deep self-observation. Individuals are encouraged to carefully monitor the range of emotions that manifest in daily circumstances. It is necessary to critically examine and question spontaneous, impulsive behavioral reactions and then meticulously investigate their true roots and causes. Instead of passively accepting the formula, "he is what he is," it is far more productive to ask the fundamental question, what shaped this behavior pattern? Was there a specific life situation that served as a catalyst, or is it the result of repeated exposure to certain beliefs, perhaps internalized during childhood? Such an introspective approach and deep reflection open the gates to a fundamentally new, deeper level of self-knowledge and understanding of one's own personality. And as soon as these gates are slightly opened, a completely different, unexplored world of inner landscapes appears before the individual. However, merely acknowledging the existence of the so-called shadow, a concept denoting repressed aspects of the personality, is only the starting point. The inevitable next question arises, what are the next steps? How can one effectively interact with and manage those aspects found in the most hidden depths of the psychic apparatus? This is where the focus shifts to one of the most fascinating and profound aspects of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, the fundamental role of the unconscious and the phenomenon of archetypes, which are often formed or activated as a result of traumatic experiences. The unconscious represents a vast, invisible dimension of the human psyche that, nonetheless, exerts a decisive influence on the vast majority of decisions made, the range of emotions experienced, and an individual's general behavioral patterns. Carl Jung went down in history as one of the pioneers who, with unprecedented depth and systematicity, embarked on the exploration of this hidden part of the human psyche, convincingly demonstrating that the inner world of each person contains significantly more layers and dimensions than what is directly accessible to conscious awareness. In addition to serving as a repository for repressed or forgotten memories and experiences, the unconscious also actively participates in shaping persistent patterns of thought and emotional reactions that an individual unconsciously reproduces repeatedly in their daily life, often without even noticing these profound influences. Imagine a person deeply gripped by an irrational fear of abandonment, whose origins remain a mystery to them. It is highly probable that this distressing fear is not a product of adulthood, but is rooted in early years marked by an unstable emotional environment. Perhaps it was a consequence of parental detachment or experiences related to rejection. In the depths of the human unconscious, Carl Jung asserted, powerful driving forces called archetypes operate. These are universal patterns of behavior and perception, inherent to all humanity, that profoundly influence our existence and how we view the world around us. When an individual experiences traumatic events in childhood, certain archetypes become activated, subtly guiding their life path. A classic example of such influence is the victim archetype. After experiencing painful events in childhood, a person begins to perceive themselves as a helpless being, completely devoid of control over their own destiny. This archetype can manifest in ingrained thoughts such as, "Everything always goes wrong for me," or "Everything I do is utterly meaningless." Another common archetype emerging as a consequence of traumatic experience is the savior archetype. Many people who grew up in chaotic or cruel environments develop an irresistible need to rescue others, having learned at some point in their lives that their own worth lies in providing help, rather than simply in their existence. As a result, they often find themselves involved in destructive relationships, take on others' responsibilities, and consistently prioritize the needs of others over their own. How many times have we seen emotionally exhausted individuals whose lives have become an endless attempt to solve other people's problems? But how do these archetypal patterns reveal themselves in daily life? One can imagine a person who, often unconsciously, consistently enters relationships with emotionally unavailable partners, or someone who subconsciously hinders their own career advancement, gripped by a fear of potential success. Such behavioral patterns are not accidental. They stem from deep-seated narratives that the unconscious tirelessly reproduces, rooted in early childhood traumas. And what's most remarkable is that the more these patterns are ignored, the more persistently they repeat, as if the subconscious is sending an unequivocal signal. This is not yet resolved, and so I will put you in a similar situation again. The primary step to breaking this cyclical scenario is recognizing which archetype dominates a person's life. Has the individual taken on the role of an eternal victim, a tireless savior, or perhaps an exhausted warrior who never seeks help? Each of these behavioral models is deeply rooted in the subconscious, and merely bringing them into conscious awareness represents significant progress. An effective practice is to observe which circumstances trigger the most intense emotional responses in a person, and what causes the most irritation in the behavior of others. Which life difficulties or scenarios tend to repeat constantly in their destiny? By asking oneself such questions, one can arrive at surprising revelations. Haven't you noticed how a certain pattern, defying logical explanation, repeatedly manifests in someone's life? Has such a thing never revealed itself in an individual's experience? It's important to note that archetypes, these deep structures of the human psyche, are not immutable and static. Once an individual achieves awareness of them, their transformation becomes possible. Carl Jung called this process individuation, a comprehensive path of self-knowledge and the harmonious integration of unconscious elements. This implies that a person is not destined to remain a prisoner of their past experiences, but to bring about such profound changes, a willingness is required to bravely confront one's own shadows, those unconscious aspects residing in the depths of their mind. It is in this context that one of the most captivating concepts of Jungian psychology comes to the forefront, the notion of the inner child. Within every adult, regardless of age and experience, the very child who never truly disappeared continues to live and function. Carl Jung viewed this inner child as a fundamental component of the psyche, encompassing both sparkling, spontaneous joy and immediacy, as well as the deepest, sometimes unhealed wounds. Many of the emotional difficulties people face in adulthood often stem precisely from this inner aspect having been ignored, suppressed, or traumatized at some point. When a child grows up in an environment where they do not feel truly loved, valued, or securely protected, this negative experience becomes firmly embedded in the unconscious. Subsequently, it manifests in adult behavior in various ways. It can be expressed as tangible difficulties in trusting others, a constant fear of social rejection, or an insatiable need for external approval. However, a natural question arises: how does one recognize that the inner child is in pain or has been wounded? There are several characteristic indicators of this state: incessant and sometimes excessive self-criticism, an inability or difficulty in accepting praise and compliments, and a persistent feeling of inner emptiness, or a strong conviction of one's own inadequacy, a sense that one never achieves perfection. These deeply ingrained experiences are often echoes of messages received in early life, words spoken by parents, mentors, or other significant adults who, perhaps unknowingly, formed a distorted self-perception. Thus, a child constantly compared to others may grow into an individual convinced of the need to be flawless to earn love and recognition, and one whose emotional expressions were systematically ignored or invalidated can become an adult who finds it extremely difficult not only to recognize but also to adequately express their own feelings. Encouragingly, there is also a hopeful side to this situation. The inner child does not disappear without a trace. It merely recedes into the shadows, patiently awaiting for its voice to be heard and its existence acknowledged. To begin the process of healing this hidden part of the personality, it is crucial to establish a full dialogue with it. This can be achieved through various methods, but one simple yet extraordinarily effective technique stands out: writing a letter to your childhood self. In this letter, you are invited to ask your inner child what it lacked in the past, what fears plagued it, and what words of comfort or support it would have wanted to hear then. Although this exercise may seem elementary, many people are surprised to discover how profound and powerful emotions it can release, opening a path to understanding and inner reconciliation. One effective method contributing to inner well-being is recalling and subsequently resuming those activities that filled childhood with genuine joy. Whether it's spontaneous dancing for no apparent reason, absorbed drawing, or carefree play with a beloved pet. Each of these actions serves as a bridge to reconnect with that essential and highly significant part of the human psyche that often remains in the shadow of adult routine. Furthermore, a critically important step is the practice of benevolent self-talk. Often a person becomes their own harshest judge, endlessly replaying in their mind the same harsh, sometimes demeaning phrases that may have been internalized from past experiences. When a toddler takes their first steps, stumbles and falls, no one rushes to label them incapable. Instead, they are immediately encouraged to try again. A natural question arises: why isn't such patience and leniency extended to oneself? The truth is, the manner of internal communication is crucial. It can either strengthen and invigorate, or, conversely, suppress and deplete that part of the personality known as the inner child. No less significant is the development of the ability to accept one's own emotions. If, during upbringing, an individual was taught to suppress expressions of sorrow, swallow tears, or constantly project outward composure and strength, there's a high probability they unconsciously learn to ignore their genuine feelings. However, it's important to understand that emotions don't disappear without a trace. They tend to accumulate and then find an outlet through other manifestations, such as baseless anxiety, heightened irritability, or even various physical ailments. Developing the habit of consciously naming and identifying what one feels without any internal or external judgment in itself represents a colossal step towards inner healing and harmony. Reflecting on physical manifestations, it should be noted that childhood trauma is not limited to the realm of the mind. It is deeply rooted in bodily memory. Many emotional blockages a person carries can manifest through muscle tension, digestive issues, or even chronic pain syndromes. A natural question arises: how does the body retain such memories, and more importantly, how can they be released? It is a common belief that trauma is exclusively a psychological phenomenon, yet researchers of the psyche like Carl Jung and many others have pointed out that the human body also serves as a vast repository of emotional suffering. What isn't resolved and processed on a mental level ultimately gets stored in muscle tissues, affects posture, alters breathing patterns, and even impacts internal organs. This is why some individuals experience inexplicable tension in their shoulders, a constant tightness in their chest, or face chronic gastrointestinal problems without apparent medical reasons. The body has its own language, and often it tells a story that the mind stubbornly refuses to hear. Modern science has convincingly confirmed this unbreakable link between traumatic experience and bodily reactions. Researchers like Bessel van der Kolk, author of the renowned book The Body Keeps the Score, explain in detail that traumatic experiences trigger physiological responses that can become permanent. The nervous system, when subjected to systematic stress at an early age, can enter a state of heightened alert, where the body continuously reacts as if under threat, even in the absence of real danger. This condition can cause chronic anxiety, sleep disturbances, and even persistent muscle pain. If you've ever wondered why your body remains in constant tension without apparent reason, perhaps the answer lies in memories you haven't yet been able to release. Thus, a pressing question arises: how can one free the physical body from these invisible yet palpable traces of the past? One of the most effective practices, without a doubt, is movement. Whether it's leisurely walking, expressive dancing, harmonious yoga, or even the simplest stretching exercises, all these activities can help release years of accumulated tension. What might at first seem like a mere daily warm-up actually has the potential to release emotions that have been trapped in the body since childhood. Breathing techniques also demonstrate their power, as they effectively contribute to nervous system regulation, bringing consciousness and mind back to the present moment. Another very notable approach is somatic therapy, which specifically works with bodily memories. This therapy aims to help the body complete natural reactions that were interrupted or suppressed in the past. For example, a child who experienced intense fear might have instinctively felt an impulse to run away, but for some reason couldn't carry out that action. Such an unfulfilled impulse remains trapped in the body, generating anxiety and internal tension many years later. It is precisely bodily therapies that allow these natural, unfinished reactions to finally reach their logical conclusion, bringing palpable emotional and physical relief. Often a person may feel that their body holds inexplicable tension, the source of which seems unclear. Sometimes physical pains and general discomfort are indeed closely linked to deeply suppressed emotional states. Such sensations often resonate with the experiences of many people. Furthermore, making minor adjustments to one's daily routine can significantly contribute to the reunification of the physical and mental aspects. For instance, practicing conscious breathing for a few minutes immediately after waking, gently massaging areas of the body where tension has accumulated, or even pausing momentarily to focus on how one sits, moves, or breathes, all these simple yet profound actions serve as a starting point for initiating this important process. If one views the human body as an open book, then every pain, every discomfort or ailment appears as individual pages that need to be carefully read and understood. And as a person delves into reading these pages, they begin to grasp certain deep-seated patterns. Thus, an understanding emerges that certain emotional states and physical ailments are closely linked to specific episodes of personal history. This insight is of colossal importance for the process of individuation, a central concept developed by Carl Jung, which teaches us how to transform suffering and pain into a source of inner strength. However, a natural question arises: how does this process work? How can an individual successfully integrate their shadow, acknowledge and process their traumas, to ultimately become a more whole and complete version of themselves? Carl Jung asserted that individuation is nothing less than the path of becoming who we truly are, our authentic self. It is a profound and sometimes difficult journey of self-discovery that demands considerable courage, as it inevitably forces one to look deep within and confront all aspects they have diligently avoided until now. This process is not an instantaneous act happening overnight. Rather, it unfolds throughout a person's entire life. Nevertheless, only a few truly dare to complete this journey, as it is far easier and more familiar to project one's own shadows onto others and blame the external world for one's inner conflicts and turmoil. But those who refuse to face their own wounds inevitably become their prisoners. Thus, individuation appears as the ultimate act of liberation. The primary stage on the path to inner transformation is profound awareness. The renowned psychoanalyst Jung emphasized that until the unconscious is brought into the realm of consciousness, it will continue to dictate the terms of a person's existence unopposed, and they will mistakenly perceive this as unavoidable fate. Individuals often feel trapped by certain life circumstances, completely unaware that their own unconscious patterns, hidden from direct view, generate these constantly recurring scenarios. Haven't you observed how some individuals invariably get involved in the same destructive or toxic relationships, or how others, despite their efforts, constantly teeter on the brink of collapse? Regardless of their desire for progress and change, such events are by no means accidental. These are merely echoes and reproductions of unconscious urges attempting to bring unresolved inner conflicts to the surface, demanding understanding and resolution. But how does one break this vicious cycle? First and foremost, it is crucial to become aware of which deep-seated patterns dominate a person's life and guide their actions. To begin practical work, the following exercise is suggested. Individuals are encouraged to focus on and identify the 3 most frequently recurring difficulties they regularly encounter, whether in interpersonal relationships, professional activities, or aspects of self-perception and self-esteem. It is important to carefully note which specific scenarios and situations tend to repeat themselves. The individual should then ask a key question. When in my childhood did I first feel this way? This seemingly simple inquiry can reveal the deep essence and origins of these entrenched problems. For instance, if a person constantly feels undervalued at work, it is quite possible that during their upbringing they often heard about the need to exert maximum effort to earn approval or acceptance. Similarly, if an individual is constantly tormented by the fear of abandonment, this deeply rooted insecurity may originate in childhood years when they might have felt left or betrayed by a significant figure. However, merely uncovering the origins of a problem is not exhaustive. The next, truly fundamental step is the process of re-evaluation. Many people remain captives of the so-called victim narrative for years, tirelessly blaming their parents, societal norms, or relentless fate for their lives. But such an attitude cannot transform pain into a source of inner strength. It only prolongs and solidifies suffering. Carl Jung, a prominent thinker, suggested that true healing occurs when an individual is able to give an entirely new meaning to their past experiences. This does not mean denying the pain experienced or downplaying the significance of past events, but rather allows one to see this experience as an integral part of one's own development rather than a final and irreversible verdict. To make this idea more vivid and tangible, one can turn to the ancient metaphor of the blacksmith. When raw, unrefined metal is placed in a scorching furnace, it becomes remarkably pliable and flexible. However, for it to achieve its final functional form, it must be repeatedly and firmly hammered, with each blow directed purposefully. A similar process occurs with the human psyche. Life's adversities, difficulties, and deep pains are like this intense fire, which makes our inner essence receptive to the deepest transformation. But without an active process of shaping, which in Jungian psychology is called individuation, a person remains merely an amorphous, raw material, lacking definition and genuine control over their own existence. A crucial aspect of this transformational process is the integration of what is known as the shadow. Often people face internal conflict, rejecting traits within themselves that they perceive as negative. For example, if an individual was taught from childhood that expressing anger is unacceptable, they may suppress this powerful emotion until it erupts in a destructive form. Similarly, if a person has learned that demonstrating vulnerability is equivalent to weakness, they risk becoming emotionally closed off and detached. However, Carl Jung, an eminent thinker, taught that one should not strive for the complete elimination of these dark aspects of the psyche, but rather consciously integrate them. Thus, someone who has suppressed their anger for many years may discover that when properly directed, this same energy transforms into determination and genuine inner strength. Likewise, an individual who fears vulnerability can realize that accepting their own emotions makes them more resilient, not weaker. Furthermore, creative activity plays a key fundamental role in this complex process. Many of the suppressed experiences and emotions can find their expression through various forms of art, painting, literature, music, or even active physical exercise. Jung viewed art as a kind of bridge connecting the conscious and unconscious, a unique tool that allows one to bring to the surface inner content that cannot be accessed solely through rational thought. If anyone has ever experienced a deep sense of relief after writing down a problem, creating a drawing without worrying about the final result, or dancing, completely surrendering to movement without thinking about what they are doing, they have already touched upon a part of this profound integration process. There is a truly fascinating aspect to this life journey. As a person delves deeper into the process of individuation, they discover that their reactivity to the external world significantly decreases. Circumstances that might have easily unsettled them or caught them off guard are now perceived with much greater calm and inner stability. Individuals who previously had the power to disturb or irritate gradually lose their hold over their emotional state. Such a transformation occurs because, by integrating one's own hidden aspects or shadows, a person unconsciously stops projecting them onto others. This can be compared to being trapped in a theatrical production where everyone around seemed to be puppets of an invisible script they didn't even suspect, and then suddenly realizing oneself as the full-fledged director of one's own unique drama. However, it is worth noting that this process does not imply the complete disappearance of pain or the forgetting of past experiences. The past inevitably continues to exist in memory, and the emotional scars left by traumatic experiences are not erased without a trace. Nevertheless, there is a colossal difference between a bleeding, open wound and a healed scar. The former causes sharp pain at the slightest touch, symbolizing an unfinished healing process, while the latter is merely a painless reminder that one has already successfully overcome significant trials. This is precisely the genuine, profound power of individuation. It allows one to transform deep wounds into invaluable wisdom, convert suffering into personal growth, and a once frightening shadow into an inexhaustible source of inner strength and resilience. Despite all these transformations, there is one area of human existence where the impact of childhood trauma manifests with truly maximum intensity: interpersonal relationships. Regardless of whether it concerns interactions with romantic partners, close friends, or even colleagues at work, deep childhood wounds continue to resonate, noticeably influencing every act of communication. Important questions arise. How does this past, with its unhealed imprints, shape and define the way a person interacts with others? And what needs to be done to break the vicious cycle of repeating destructive behavioral patterns, paving the way for building more fulfilling, healthy, and harmonious relationships? Initial relationships formed in early life profoundly influence how a person perceives the world and the people in it. The eminent thinker Carl Jung asserted that childhood experience serves as a foundation for creating certain internal models or archetypes, which subsequently become guiding principles for all subsequent interpersonal connections. When a child develops in an atmosphere of unconditional love, acceptance, and complete safety, they typically form a secure attachment, which manifests in the ability to trust others and freely express their true feelings and emotions. However, if childhood years were overshadowed by neglect, systematic emotional abuse, or constant instability, this traumatic experience can crystallize into destructive behavioral patterns that are relentlessly reproduced throughout adulthood. The most notable and perhaps intriguing aspect is that these patterns are not always overtly or obviously manifested. Often, an individual who experienced a deep sense of rejection during their formative years can develop an outwardly independent personality, a person who appears completely self-sufficient and needing no one. However, at its core, this superficial independence is often merely an ingenious defense mechanism, a kind of invisible shield designed to protect the person from the potential of being hurt again. Similarly, someone who was deprived of sufficient affection, warmth, and unconditional acceptance in childhood may develop an anxious attachment style characterized by a continuous search for approval from others and a constant fear of being left or abandoned. Observing such behavioral models in others or recognizing them in one's own behavior is an important step towards understanding their deep nature. The unconscious, as is known, possesses an amazing ability to strive for the healing of old emotional wounds. It often pushes a person to repeat certain life scenarios and behavioral models, harboring the silent hope that this time the outcome will be completely different. It is for this reason that some individuals constantly find themselves involved in destructive, toxic relationships, choosing partners who treat them similarly to how they were treated in their childhood. This does not happen out of a hidden desire to suffer, but rather from a deep, unconscious desire to rewrite their personal history, to finally find the love and acceptance they so desperately lacked in the distant past. Unfortunately, however, this internal search rarely leads to the desired result. The constant reproduction of the same patterns only exacerbates existing trauma, reinforcing in the person's psyche the belief that love inevitably brings pain, or that no one in this world can be trusted. Thus, instead of resolution, only a deepening of internal conflict and negative attitudes occurs. To break this vicious cycle, it is critically important to recognize its existence and mechanisms of action. A wonderful tool for this can be the practice of mindful observation of one's own relationships. One should ask themselves, is there a recurring pattern here? Do I always choose the same type of people? Do my relationships repeatedly trigger the same fears and feelings of insecurity? Such deep self-analysis can reveal many previously hidden unconscious dynamics that relentlessly shape and direct an individual's life path. However, there is a hopeful prospect, the possibility of re-evaluating past experiences and building healthier relationships. The path to this begins with taking personal responsibility. Quite often, people enter partnerships by placing hopes on another person to fill their own emotional void, but such an expectation harbors significant danger. As Jung noted, individuals tend to project onto their partners what has not been resolved and integrated within themselves. It is precisely this dynamic that often leads to the collapse of many unions. When a person expects to be loved in a way that perhaps their parents did not love them, they involuntarily place an exorbitant burden on their partner, which inevitably leads to deep disappointments. True love, on the contrary, is born not out of need or deficiency, but out of inner fullness and self-sufficiency. How can this inner wholeness be achieved? A fundamental step is developing the ability to assert oneself. If an individual has constantly sought approval from others, they should try asking themselves, if no one's approval were required, what would I do differently? This simple reflection can reveal how many decisions were made solely to please others. Furthermore, building healthier relationships is inextricably linked to establishing clear and distinct boundaries. Many people who have experienced childhood trauma face significant difficulties in being able to say no, fearing rejection. However, the ability to protect one's interests and needs is one of the greatest acts of self-love one can afford. Often, some individuals strive for greater detachment, while others experience a deep fear of abandonment. Rebuilding one's way of interacting with others is a process that requires significant time, but it invariably brings deep liberation. When an individual gradually begins to free themselves from established behavioral patterns, space opens up for something significantly greater, for a genuine understanding of their essence beyond the influence of past traumas. However, a legitimate question arises: what is the true nature of a person without their pain points? What remains when they stop identifying solely through the prism of past adversities? Traumatic experiences in childhood can leave an indelible mark on one's personality, significantly affecting cognitive processes, emotional well-being, and the individual's interactions with the world. But there is also good news. These internal wounds do not have to serve as a constant measure of one's identity. The healing process is entirely achievable, and its initial stage lies in a deep understanding of how to overcome this historical pain. And here it is appropriate to ask, are there ways to transform this suffering into a powerful source of deep self-knowledge and personal development?